Now we had our first little Ionic Angular application. Nothing too fancy in there, but I hope you saw how we will generally work with Ionic. That we in the end have a setup where I will explain in more detail how things are working together there, where we can use these Ionic web components to build nice user interfaces. Now, Ionic hasn't always been about web components though. Historically with Ionic 1, Ionic was all about creating mobile apps with Angular 1. And Ionic 1 was released in 2013. In the end, what Ionic 1 did was it didn't create web components. That wasn't possible back then. You couldn't create your own HTML elements. Browsers didn't support that. But it used Angular 1 directives, custom directives, to essentially also give you custom components, but custom Angular components in the end, which run only inside of Angular apps. Now, Ionic 2 continued this in 2016 by giving you the same for Angular 2, which was a brand new version of Angular, which is totally different to Angular 1. The two have basically nothing in common indeed. So Ionic 2 gave you again Angular components, not web components, Angular components. And again, therefore, you could only use Ionic 2 in Angular 2 applications. Now, there also was an Ionic 3, which basically added some new features, enhanced Ionic a little bit, but it was still focused on Angular. At that time, Angular 4 was out, but still, Angular 4, despite the name, as you should know, is just the same as Angular 2 in its core, as is Angular 7, 8, and so on. All these new versions are simply named like this. They're all based on Angular 2. So we still could only build Angular Ionic apps there. And the Ionic team decided that this would not be optimal for the future, because not all people are using Angular. You, of course, probably are, otherwise you'd not be taking this course, but you could be using React, or you could be using Vue, or no framework at all, and maybe you want to use some Ionic components. Maybe not even all of them, but some of them. Or you do want to use all of them, because you do want to build a native mobile app with Ionic. Well, then you were limited to Angular. With Ionic 4, you aren't anymore. Ionic 4 and all the future versions of Ionic are based on web components. And this is a browser specification that allows you to add your own HTML elements that run totally independent from any web framework you might be using. So you're independent from Angular and so on, because in the end, all you need here is JavaScript. These web components use JavaScript under the hood, and every browser supports JavaScript. And therefore, web components in Ionic 4 can be used with any framework, any web framework, or no framework at all if you want to. And that is pretty cool. Now, also a word on the future of Ionic. In the past, we had Ionic 2 and 3 and 1. Now we have Ionic 4, and we'll get a new version every 6 months. But just as with Angular 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, these new versions don't change everything. There are small incremental enhancements where the majority will stay the same. Your knowledge you need will stay the same. Only some enhancements are made, minor features are introduced, and all these changes will happen in a backward compatible way so that you have loads of time of updating your app if needed, and often you don't even need to update anything. So this is not like, oh god, I gotta learn something new in 6 months. You don't. This is the Ionic history and a brief look into its future, and that is why Ionic 4 and future versions of that is and will be the best versions of Ionic we've ever had, because we got so much flexibility with these versions.